Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the wrapping up of World War I and the getting in to World War II, right? Now, the big thing about it, though, it is really crazy when you think for 2 seconds about how close these wars are, right? Like the volume of famous figures that were involved in both, right? Winston Churchill, Adolf Hitler, right? Like Hitler literally fought in World War I and then became dictator of Germany for World War II. Like it's wild, right? So the thing about it though is it's actually not ridiculous to actually even consider that the College Board is putting these two things together. It just feels like there's such monumental conflicts that they should always be separate in their own tests and stuff like that. But it's okay, and we're moving in the right direction. And we just finished up in class the Russian Civil War, the Russian Revolution, and now we're not even calling them Russia anymore. They're now called the USSR, right? The USSR are the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, right? And we'll talk a lot about them a little bit later on as well. We'll talk about the rise of communism and a communist dictatorship that existed in the Soviet Union under Stalin a little bit later. Spoiler alert, he's the one that actually beats up Trotsky. But going into it, though, let's pick up where we left off in class, talking about the final phases of World War I. So we're now getting into these final phases of World War I, where we're basically talking about the devastation that has been wrought all over the continent, right? Because by 1917, northern France is destroyed. Russia is out of the game after the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, right? And after Lenin has led the October Revolution. Also, Austria-Hungary is dissolving. It literally actually broke up and dissolved into multiple different countries before the war was even over. In October of 1918, they just start going like, and just like falling apart like it's so bad. Going into it also, Britain is almost bankrupt. Germany is revolting as well. The Germans are revolting against their own government, right? You got literally riots breaking out in the streets like this one right here of deserting soldiers and citizens piling up newspapers in front of them and shooting at police officers that are coming to tell them to stop their demonstration and protest against the ongoing war itself. You also have this thing right here, the Kiel Mutiny, which is literally an entire boat of German soldiers that refused to sail out on a mission because they were like, no, I don't want to fight in this war anymore, right? Super weird. So now going into it though, you have literally a German country revolting against itself, and then you've got the German politicians, conspiracy theory, maybe doing or maybe not doing something very, very all important. And it was this moment known as the Zimmermann telegram, right? In 1917, there was a telegram. And for all of y'all that know what a telegram is, you know what I'm talking about, like the dee, like literally like a telegram that was sent, right? From Germany to another country, right? But it was intercepted by Britain and then brought to American attention, right? And so basically what happened was it was a secret telegram apparently sent from Germany to Mexico, right? They sent it from Germany to Mexico, telling Mexico to invade the United States, right? This Zimmermann note, right? Zimmermann was actually the German ambassador to Mexico, or not, like, so he was a German ambassador, and he wrote this telegram to the German ambassador to Mexico, telling him to convince the Mexican government to invade the United States. And if they had actually agreed to invade, then Germany would give them tanks, armaments, weapons, and the things to do so, and if they were agreed to do it, they would give them back the lands of Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, lands that they had long ago lost to the United States, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is that apparently this secret telegram got intercepted by the Brits, right, and then was brought to the attention of the Americans. And then after it was brought to the attention of the Americans, it was published in U.S. newspapers, and it is going to be the thing that launches the United States into war, right? Now, there's another thing as well. Do me a favor, jot this down, all right? I don't have it on the slide, but jot this down. Also, because Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, right? Like, that's a really big reason why as well, because I don't know if you remember this or not, but as of 1915, when they sunk the Lusitania, and the Americans were like, hey, stop that, don't do that anymore. And they immediately said, like, do not, like, commence unrestricted submarine warfare anymore whatsoever, or we will get involved. Well, they did it, right? Because in 1917 and in the later phases of the war, the Germans are trying their best to end the war by going on all-out offensives, right? An offensive, what I mean by that is like attacking the other side of the army or attacking your enemy with full force, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit more here in about 2 seconds. But basically what ends up happening is that the unrestricted submarine warfare coming back and the Zimmermann telegram coupled together launches the United States into the war itself. Now, Germany is going to attempt to end that war, end World War I, and force France and Great Britain to surrender before the Americans ever get there by having a massive summer offensive in the end of 1917. But the thing about it, though, is it just does not work. And by the time that the Americans get there in the spring of 1918, their forces overwhelm the German lines and begin to push the Western Front all the way back into Germany. And what happens in this point as well is Wilhelm II, that dead-armed king of Germany, abdicates the throne and runs away to the Netherlands, actually, which is an interesting little fact. The Weimar Republic would be installed, and Germany would surrender World War I and take the loss of World War I on the 11th of November, 1918. That's wrong. Why did I put 1914? That's dumb. So that's a typo, right? Because it goes like this. On the 11th day of the 11th month of the 11th hour in 1918, World War I ended, right? Because basically, literally on the 11th of November at 11 a.m., right, World War I came to a close. And I know some of y'all are immediately like, was it 11 a.m.? I don't know. I really hope so, though. And I hope somebody made a wish. But in 1918, World War I came to an end. Then we eventually began to celebrate that as a country as Armistice Day. Now we call it Veterans Day, right? But the Zimmerman telegram will be the thing that... Sorry about that. Quick scene change. Also, it doesn't really matter because that last flip was really stinking up the room, right? Literally, I swear, I just can't record flips early in the morning anymore. It just does not hit the same, right? The big thing about it, though, is picking up right where we just left off about a second ago. We were getting into the end of World War I. There we go. And we are now moving into how are we going to bring peace to this whole situation, right? Germany has surrendered. They officially surrendered on November 11th, 1918, not 14. My bad on the typo. The big thing about it, though, is we're now getting into a little bit of a deeper understanding about how do you bring peace after everyone is upset after a worldwide war that they feel like it's someone's fault, right? Well, we're going into this thing called the Paris Peace Conference, right? Where all the leaders of state of the Allied powers and the winning powers showed up, except Russia. It's a whole thing, right? So now, and mostly just because Russia's no longer Russia, it's now the USSR. But you got David Lloyd George right there, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. You got Victor Orlando right there, who is actually from Italy. You got Georges Clemenceau, who's got the best bushy little cookie duster that you've ever seen. And then you've got this guy right over here, good old Woodrow Wilson from the United States of America, right? Well, the thing about it is that they got to figure out is who is there going to be to blame. And what you need to understand is much like this red line, it didn't perfectly separate this group like that. This red line should actually be right here in front of Wilson alone, just in front of Wilson. And why that is because there's an ideological split, right? So going into this entire meeting, into the Paris Peace Conference, Woodrow Wilson, had this thing that is sometimes coined Wilsonian idealism, right? Where he saw a beautiful rainbow-like situation of being able to be like, you know how we actually solved this without avoiding while avoiding a war going forward? We blame no one. Blame no one for the war itself, right? Blame no one, and let's keep a document that makes everything super simple, right? And he proposed a document to bring an end to the war, unlike ones that had come before it. It wasn't going to be a treaty. It was going to just be a series of principles that the world should live by, right? And that thing was called the 14 points because there was literally 14 rules on it, right? This document laid out 14 different provisions that were supposed to prevent future war and assigned no blame to anyone, right? And it's a very simple document that calls for a lot of different stuff, right? The removal of all economic barriers, right? Free trade over the seas, no unrestricted submarine warfare. The reorganization of territory, right? For example, like literally Alsace-Lorraine, right? That whole thing, trying to figure out all that stuff, right? We're going to readjust the frontiers of a lot of colonies. We're going to dissolve Austria-Hungary, right? We're going to create Poland. Love that for them, right? And then these 14 points, he also called for the creation in his 14th point, probably the most important one out of all of them, was this thing, an association of nations must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and making sure that everybody stays square, right? So what he called for is a League of Nations, the thing that kind of predated the modern day United Nations, right? But the other European powers were like, we don't want any of this softy crap in here. We want to blame somebody, and they liked a different treaty instead. The European powers came in, and they actually called for this thing called the Treaty of Versailles. What do you want?
Can I see my grade?
No, get out. I'm recording a flip. Get out. This is for my AP class. Get.
Hi, Kyla.
Oh my God, get out.
Okay.
So, yeah, all right, anyway, now. So, wait for me in front of my door. I'll be out there in a few minutes.
Okay.
Anyway, biggest thing about it, though, is they wanted to adopt instead the Treaty of Versailles, right? And the Treaty of Versailles was a document that the big European powers wanted to blame Germany with. right? They were like, we want Germany to sign this thing called the War Guilt Clause, which says that they take ownership and onus of blame for this war. When ironically enough, you should be blaming like Austria more than anybody else, just because like they're the ones who declared war on Serbia, and then also Germany escalated the war, sure, whenever they turned around and declared war on France out of nowhere, but it's not necessarily their fault. But Germany was completely blamed in this document. Germany would also be forced to pay reparations of $33 billion, right, which is ridiculous. And I think adjusted for inflation, it's somewhere in the trillions of dollars, right? And so another thing about it, though, is this giving up of German colonies and giving that away to the other powers in this thing called the Mandate System, right? Where basically the winners came in and called dibs on all of Germany's old colonies, and that led to a huge problem, especially in the Middle East, where people start kind of scrambling for petroleum, right? Now, going into it, though, also German demilitarization, making their army only about 500, I think it's like 500,000, I have to look up the numbers, but making their army small and vulnerable and basically in existence, right? Also, the demilitarization plan also said that they weren't allowed to have an air force, that they weren't allowed to have submarines anymore, and that their navy had to be severely reduced, right? They also wanted to create Poland, so they took that from the 14 points. They were like, okay, we can agree on the 14 points. And they also wanted to create this area known as the demilitarized zone, which is in the Rhineland between France and Germany, right? And this also is going to create this thing known as the Weimar Republic. The problem is, though, is this document is going to leave that Weimar Republic extremely weak, as characterized, of course, in that burning of the Hindenburg that we looked at the other day. Now, Wilson felt that this treaty would lead directly to another war, right? And he was right, okay? Like now, and the thing about it, though, is as well, we never ratified it. Wilson was like, I refuse to ratify that treaty as it is just leading to further aggression. And that is ridiculous. We need to stop doing these things. We don't want to go to another war. We want to stop war from happening again, right? So it was never ratified by the United States. The League of Nations, though, they took that from the 14 points and they did create it. The European powers were like, all right, fine, we're going to go with the Treaty of Versailles, but we'll give you your little League of Nations, America. And then we never joined it, right? And so like the United States is like, I ain't being in that thing. It ain't what we wanted for it. Like, so yeah, and then also the USSR never joined it, and Germany wasn't allowed in it, right? So this League of Nations was weak from the get-go, right? And also the map is going to be completely redrawn of Europe. Following 1914, the map is going to now be redrawn to include places like Poland, now Yugoslavia, which is a now united Southern Balkan Slavic state. Czechoslovakia will appear. Alsace-Lorraine goes back to France, and there's also the dissolution, which means the breaking up of the Ottoman Empire and of Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary used to be this giant empire right there. Now it's just Austria and just Hungary, right? And Yugoslavia is now going to grow out of this entire process. And then also Poland, of course, shows up. You also have this little East Prussia over here, which is ridiculous. And then also, as you can see, we now have Turkey. No more Ottoman Empire, just the state of Turkey, right? So, which is going to be coming out of 1918 and out of the Paris Peace Accords, right? Now, the interwar years is what we're moving into now. This time period between the wars, right? From 1929 to about 1939, which actually really could, when you're looking at this, it should be actually closer to like 1933 because of the rise of Hitler and stuff like that. But we're not going to get into those waters just yet, right? Now, the interwar years, from a European perspective, is oftentimes coined as the name of the Age of Anxiety, right? And we're going to get into why that is. Now, from the American perspective, you know of this time period as the Roaring Twenties, what it started off with, right? The Roaring Twenties. And we'll talk about what happened in the 30s and why it wasn't so roaring anymore here in a little bit. We'll actually talk about that in class some. But the Roaring Twenties was the big time period for the winners, right? If you won World War I, you saw a rise in the Roaring Twenties, right? You saw economic gain and a boost in the 1920s because there was a rise of this thing called a consumer economy, right? The consumer economy exploded in the 1920s, and you saw the creation of modern appliances, right? Now you can go out and you can get your wife a refrigerator, right? Good job, Richard, right? Oh God, if I got my wife a refrigerator, she'd punch me in the face. Now, so really quick though, also, cheap fashions are coming out, affordable knits, new fashions period, personal care products, pharmacies are gonna blow up, places like Walgreens and are gonna be created, and then there's also another place called Woolworths, which is a department store. Sears, I believe, was a thing that was started in the 1920s. I'll have to look that up. Now, travel though, for leisure is gonna be a big deal. The auto industry is gonna explode. There you go, Alexandra. Henry Ford, Model T, blah, all that fun stuff, right? And electricity is now going to be like sweeping most countries because they're going to start putting power lines up all over the place, right? Now, not in rural areas, but in most areas, right? Now, and then also telephone wires will be laid in many different countries, right? The Roaring Twenties is characterized by these things, but the things you could really see that kind of show the difference in the Roaring Twenties as well is forms of entertainment, right? You saw the cinema grow out of this, right? Silent movies and silent films became really, really big in the 1920s. These two are very, very famous. That right there is Charlie Chaplin. That is not Hitler with a mustache. Do not think that. That is Charlie Chaplin, who was a famous comedic actor who actually started out as a circus performer, who was in many, many, many different films in the like silent film era in the 1920s, including The Tramp, Modern Times, right? So like Modern Times is a great one. We're gonna actually look at a clip of that in class and stuff like that. And then this one, which is still to this day a creepy movie. That one's called Nosferatu. It's about not Jack-o'-lantern, Dracula, right? The radio also becomes a big deal because you could actually sit down and listen to programs every single night because most homes did not own a television, right? Because televisions don't really come out until post-1930s, until post-Depression, right? But the radio, though, everyone began to have one in their home. So news is now spreading much faster and entertainment is beginning to pop up on radios, right? You could sit down and listen to a nightly program. Another interesting thing that happened in the 1920s as well is the image and growth of the idea of the new woman, right? The new woman that is much more independent, who has many more rights than the women that came before them. And here's why, y'all, because they aided in the World War I effort. When the men went off to the front lines, the women were the ones that entered into the factories, right? They're the ones who go into the factories and they begin taking up that slack. You know what I mean? Like picking up that slack that was left behind by men leaving jobs vacant, right? Also, women demanded the right to vote because of this, right? They demanded to have, like President Wilson, support women's suffrage. And they said, we helped out in the war effort, so you owe it to us. And then by the 1920s, as we know, with the 19th Amendment in 1921, women will be allowed to vote, right? Also, old girl can work. She can dance in public, right? The flapper image of the 1920s is coming up, where she's showing a little bit more skin, and also she's even smoking in public, right? Having like shorter hair, more promiscuous, well, not promiscuous, but more fun fashions and stuff like that is going to be a really big deal. And what we're also going to see as well, though, is the growth. Oh, wait, I need to bag it up. No, bag it up. We're going to get to that stuff in here in a minute. So what we also going to see is the growth of economics, right? Because production is going to have another new big burst because assembly line production is going to come out. The 5-day work week was adopted during the 1920s. So people can actually work from Monday through Friday, and then they have a weekend, right? And then also leisure time is coming in on the weekends because really quickly, why would you want leisure time as a growing economy in a Western civilized country? Reason why is because it stimulates the economy. You're going out on the weekends now. You're going to the beach. You're buying gasoline. You're doing all this other different stuff. And then art kept getting weirder. So like art got a little bit weirder as time went on. You saw the growth of art being kind of like the secret mirror of society, right? Like a lot of people say that like the Roaring Twenties was a facade, right? Like it was a facade that was smoke and mirrors, that it wasn't real. You know what I mean? That it wasn't real in the sense of like everybody seems like they're making a lot of money, but most of this crap was bought on credit, so it's not real, right? And the thing about it though is art kind of began to represent how weird the world was still getting. This is non-representational art, which is just a bunch of lines and circles and weird stuff, and that's by Kandinsky right there, which is a very famous artist that did non-representational art. Surrealism began to grow, and that's Salvador Dali, who used to do very dreamlike scapes of odd, contorted figures, right? The Saving of St. Anthony is another one of his. Also, I have Salvador Dali in my room, right? It's the Geopolitics and Child that's over next to the door, right? And then also Dadaism became like a whole thing, right? Where literally art represented just how broken society was. These are two of the most famous pieces of Dada art. This kind of crazy collage that just shows how like World War I had like destroyed the psyche of the world. And then this one by Mutt is actually called Fountain, and that's a urinal upside down. Doesn't sound like a very good fountain. So now going into it though as well, okay, so as you can see, art's getting to move further into that modern scape, right? Now the age of anxiety though is what we should be referring to this in Europe, right? And the reason why is because for the losers and the disenfranchised, there's still a lot of bad things going on. And what I mean by the losers, I mean the losers of the war, right? If you lost the war or if you were already a minority or a disenfranchised community, things were getting worse during the 1920s, right? You saw the growth of anti-Semitism. You saw racism hitting new peaks. You saw violence against minorities, especially in the United States, in the form of lynchings and lynch mobs that actually began to occur, right? And you also saw the growth of this thing called eugenics, which we'll get to in here in about 2 seconds. But this right here is actually one of the worst days in the history of the United States. That right there is the day, I think it's June 6, 1921, and that literally was known as the Tulsa Race Riot. All right, so like when literally the entirety of a area, the entire street and district of an area known as Black Wall Street inside of Tulsa, Oklahoma was burned down and destroyed by a white lynch mob, and no one was arrested and no one was charged, right? Now, we'll get into, like, if you want to know why that happened, the Tulsa Race Riot, just ask me in class, okay? And we'll talk a little bit about it there. But eugenics, though, is going to be the growth of a really big, weird branch of science during the 1920s, which was related to social Darwinism, right? Now, Darwin never advocated for these things, right? But it's people taking his ideas and taking it a little further. It's a pseudoscience, which is a fake science. It's aimed at creating a genetically superior race by excluding people who are judged to be inferior. And you're going to see the growth of eugenics in that form of science contribute to things like the Holocaust and mass sterilization campaigns that broke out inside the United States, especially in places like California, which is like a whole thing. Now, the World War I veterans, though, as well, are going to be some of your largest people that actually have a really terrible, god-awful time following World War I, right? Because the World War I veterans are going to begin to show signs of shell shock, which are some of the earliest known cases of PTSD, right? And then also 23 million of them were injured or disfigured from the war. And a thing that we need to kind of begin to like sit on a little bit is why would these World War I veterans be prone to radical ideas, right? Why would these men who are now coming home disfigured and blinded by mustard gas, having missing limbs because of explosions, right? Not being able to work anymore and being permanently hurt for the rest of their lives, why would those guys be prone to radical ideas when people like Hitler begin to show up, right? Like, why would that be his base? Why would those be the people that he talked to? And just kind of keep that around in the back of your mind, right? And we'll talk about this lady who was super, super cool. Her name's Anna Coleman Ladd. We'll talk about her a little bit later on when we get into class. And I think she's important to talk about as a woman from history because she's just so awesome, right? But the thing about it, though, is continuing the age of anxiety, economic hardships are growing in places in like Germany and Italy, right? The reason why we need to understand this is because Germany and Italy were having terrible economic situations where hyperinflation is occurring, high unemployment, businesses are failing, leading to this concept that I like to call as fractured masculinity, savings are destroyed, and there are very weak governments in power, which is going to lead to the rise of fascism in these areas. But we're going to talk about that more in class when we talk about fascism and totalitarianism when I see y'all tomorrow.